The moment my 23-year marriage ended, I wasn't standing in a courtroom. I was sitting alone in my kitchen, staring at a notification from the security camera inside my beach house. At first, I thought it was another false alert. Then I heard my husband's voice. Richard was standing in my Seabreeze cottage with a woman I'd never seen before. He wrapped an arm around her waist and smiled. "Don't worry," he told her. "This house will be yours very soon." The woman laughed softly. "And your wife Richard didn't hesitate. Carla signs anything I put in front of her." My heart stopped, because in that moment, I realized Richard wasn't just having an affair. He was planning to take something that never belonged to him. If you've ever trusted someone with your whole heart and later discovered they were hiding a completely different life, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Before we continue, please take a moment to like and subscribe if stories like this speak to you. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were sitting in my place that night? Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I didn't sleep that night. After hearing Richard promise my beach house to another woman, I sat at my kitchen table until nearly sunrise, replaying the footage over and over again. Each time I watched it, I hoped I had misunderstood. Maybe there was another explanation. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe I wasn't hearing what I thought I was hearing. But every replay made the truth clearer. The man standing beside that woman wasn't a stranger. He was my husband. The man I had trusted for 23 years. The man I had defended countless times when friends hinted something felt off about him. The man I had built my second life around. And somehow, somewhere along the way, he had become someone I no longer recognized. As dawn light crept through my kitchen window, I poured myself a cup of coffee and stared out into my backyard. For the first time in years, I forced myself to look backward instead of making excuses. I met Richard when I was 41. 3 years earlier, my first husband, Daniel Turner, had died unexpectedly from a heart attack. One day he was healthy. The next day he was gone. Losing him shattered me. It shattered our daughter, Megan, too. She was only 17 at the time. For years after Daniel's death, my entire world revolved around survival. I worked full-time as a literature instructor at a community college in North Carolina. I cared for my aging mother. I tried to help Megan navigate college and adulthood while secretly struggling to navigate my own grief. I wasn't looking for love. I wasn't even sure I believed in it anymore. Then Richard appeared. At first, he seemed like exactly what my life needed. He was confident, successful, steady. He owned a growing construction company and carried himself with the calm certainty of a man who always knew what to do. When my car broke down, he fixed it. When my mother's roof started leaking, he had a crew there the next day. When I doubted myself, he always seemed to have an answer. After years of carrying every burden alone, his support felt like a blessing. I remember my mother warning me once. She said, "Be careful of people who solve every problem for you. Sometimes they're teaching you to depend on them." At the time, I laughed. I thought she was being overly cautious. Looking back now, I wonder if she saw something I didn't. Richard and I married 2 years later. The wedding was small, simple, just family and close friends. Megan was polite to him, though never particularly close. I assumed that was normal. After all, she was already an adult. I figured their relationship would grow naturally over time. Unfortunately, it never really did. But back then, I blamed circumstances. I never considered there might be another reason. For many years, our marriage appeared happy from the outside. We hosted holiday dinners, took weekend trips, supported each other's careers. Friends often described us as one of the strongest couples they knew. And maybe, for a while, we really were. Or maybe I simply wanted to believe we were. The one thing I never questioned was Seabreeze Cottage. The beach house had been in my family for decades. It sat on a beautiful stretch of coastline near Emerald Isle. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy. Just a weathered blue cottage overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. To most people, it was simply real estate. To me, it was home. My earliest memories lived there. I learned to swim there. I watched sunsets there with my parents. I scattered some of Daniel's ashes there after he died. Megan spent every summer of her childhood running across those sandy dunes. Every important chapter of my life somehow connected back to that little house. When my mother passed away, keeping Seabreeze Cottage became my responsibility. I promised myself it would stay in the family forever. Richard always claimed he understood that. In fact, he often said he admired it. "I love that house because you love it," he told me once. "I don't care who owns it." At the time, those words felt romantic. Now they sounded like a lie. As the years passed, subtle changes appeared in our marriage. Not dramatic changes, the kind you can easily explain away. Richard started taking more business trips. His phone was suddenly always face down. He stepped outside to answer calls. Sometimes he smiled at text messages and quickly locked the screen when I walked into the room. Whenever I asked about it, he laughed. Construction clients are needy. I accepted the explanation. Then came the criticism. At first it was harmless, or so I thought. Comments about my clothes, my hair, my memory, my age. "You're getting forgetful. You already told me that story. Maybe it's time to slow down." Individually, those comments seemed insignificant. Together, they created something else. They made me question myself. I had recently retired from teaching. I was 64 years old. Like many women my age, I occasionally misplaced my glasses, forgot where I left my keys, repeated stories. Nothing unusual. Yet Richard seemed determined to point out every minor mistake. I convinced myself he was worried about me. Now I wasn't so sure. The hardest part was how gradually everything happened. No dramatic betrayal. No obvious warning sign. Just small shifts over many years. Like a shoreline eroding grain by grain. You don't notice the damage until one day the landscape looks completely different. Around that same time, my relationship with Megan became more distant. I hated admitting that. We still spoke occasionally. We still exchanged birthday calls. But something felt strained. Conversations became shorter. Visits became less frequent. I often told myself she was busy with work and raising her daughter, Emily. Life gets complicated. Families drift apart. That happens. At least, that's what I believed. Now, sitting alone in my kitchen with that horrifying video still open on my phone, I wondered if I had been wrong about that too. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized something uncomfortable. Nearly every conflict between Megan and me over the past decade somehow involved Richard. He always had an explanation. Always had a reason. Always knew why Megan wasn't calling. Why she couldn't visit. Why she seemed upset. At the time, I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was my husband. The person I believed was on my side. The person I believed loved me. But after hearing him promise my beach house to another woman, every memory suddenly looked different. Like pieces of a puzzle I had assembled incorrectly. I stood and walked toward the window. The sun had fully risen now. Birds moved across the yard. Cars passed on the street. The world looked exactly the same, yet nothing in my life felt the same anymore. I opened the security footage again. This time I didn't focus on Richard. I focused on the woman beside him, the woman who laughed when he promised her my house. The woman who seemed completely comfortable standing inside a place filled with my family's memories. I paused the video and zoomed in. Her face became clearer. Something about her looked familiar. Not familiar enough to identify, but familiar enough to bother me. I stared at the screen. Then suddenly I remembered where I had seen her before, and the realization made my stomach drop. Because that woman wasn't a stranger. I had met her before, several times. And she already knew exactly who I was. I knew her. The moment the memory surfaced, I felt a chill run through my body. The woman standing beside my husband in Seabreeze Cottage wasn't a stranger. Her name was Vanessa Reed, and she had been in my life for far longer than I realized. I sat frozen at my kitchen table, staring at the paused image on my phone. Vanessa had attended at least 3 company events with Richard over the past 2 years. I remembered her now. Beautiful, polished, confident. The kind of woman who seemed to command attention without trying. The first time I met her had been at a charity fundraiser hosted by the local Chamber of Commerce. Richard introduced her as a commercial real estate specialist who occasionally helped his construction company locate investment properties. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Why would I? She shook my hand, complimented my necklace, asked how long Richard and I had been married. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. I never imagined she would eventually be standing in my beach house discussing her future there. With my husband. I felt sick. But feeling sick wasn't going to help me. For the first time since discovering the video, I forced myself to stop reacting emotionally and start thinking strategically. If Richard had been lying to me, I needed facts, not assumptions, facts. So I spent the next several hours downloading every piece of footage stored in the camera system at Seabreeze Cottage. The system automatically archived recordings for 90 days. I had never paid much attention to it before. Now it became the most important thing in my life. I transferred everything to my laptop, created folders, organized dates, made backups. Then I started watching. What I found made my stomach twist tighter with every passing hour. Vanessa hadn't visited the cottage once. She hadn't visited twice. She had been there repeatedly. In some recordings, Richard arrived alone and unlocked the front door. A few minutes later, Vanessa appeared. Sometimes they carried takeout food, sometimes wine. Sometimes they stayed for hours, sometimes overnight. I watched footage of them walking across the deck overlooking the ocean, holding hands, laughing, kissing. In one recording, Richard stood behind Vanessa and wrapped both arms around her waist while she admired the view. The same view where Daniel and I once watched dolphins swimming near the shoreline. The same deck where Megan learned to ride her first bicycle. the same place where my mother used to sit every morning with a cup of coffee. Now Richard had turned it into a private getaway for his affair. The betrayal cut deeper than I expected, not because he was cheating. That was horrible enough, but because of where he was cheating, he had chosen the one place that carried the most meaning in my entire life, and he had brought another woman there as if my memories meant nothing. I kept watching. A week earlier, Richard and Vanessa had spent nearly an entire Saturday inside the cottage. The audio wasn't perfect, but portions of their conversation were clear. Vanessa stood in the kitchen holding paint samples. "I hate these cabinets," she said. Richard laughed. "They'll be gone soon." "Good." She placed a sample against the wall. "I want something brighter. Brighter." She was redesigning my kitchen. A kitchen she didn't own. A kitchen she had no right to touch. Yet she spoke as if the house already belonged to her. The next recording was worse. Vanessa walked through the master bedroom. My bedroom. She opened closets, examined furniture, measured wall space. Then she pointed toward a dresser that had belonged to my mother. "That can go." Richard nodded. "Anything you don't like can go." I physically recoiled from the screen. For a moment, anger nearly overwhelmed me. I wanted to call Richard immediately. I wanted to scream, demand answers, destroy every lie he'd built, but something stopped me. Maybe instinct, maybe survival. Because deep down, I knew confronting him now would be a mistake. Richard didn't know I had seen the footage. That was my advantage. And I wasn't ready to give it away. So instead, I kept watching. Later that evening, another conversation revealed something even more troubling. Vanessa was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine. Richard sat beside her. They seemed relaxed, comfortable, like a couple planning a future together. "I already sold my condo," Vanessa said. "I know. What if this takes longer than you promised?" "It won't." Vanessa looked worried. "You keep saying that." Richard reached for her hand. "Trust me." Then he smiled. The exact smile that had once made me feel safe. "The house will be ours before the end of the year." Ours. I paused the video, rewound, played it again. The house will be ours. Not might be. Not hopefully. Will be. Richard sounded completely confident, which meant he believed he had a plan. And that plan probably involved me. I continued reviewing footage late into the evening. Around 9 o'clock, I discovered the recording that changed everything. The video began normally. Richard and Vanessa were sitting at the dining table. Several papers lay spread across the surface. Vanessa pointed toward one document. "Are you sure she'll sign?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." "What if she reads it?" Richard laughed. A cold laugh, the kind I'd never heard before. "Carla trusts me," Vanessa smiled. "Still, especially now." Then Richard said something that made my blood run cold. "She's getting more forgetful every year." Vanessa nodded. I noticed. Richard leaned back in his chair. "She won't know what she's signing." For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. I replayed that sentence over and over. She won't know what she's signing. The affair suddenly became secondary. This wasn't just infidelity. This was manipulation, planning, calculation. Richard wasn't merely betraying me emotionally. He was preparing something, some kind of transaction, some kind of paperwork, some kind of legal move. and he believed I was vulnerable enough to fall for it. I stared at the screen until my eyes hurt. Then another memory surfaced. Over the past year, Richard had become unusually interested in our finances. Not aggressively, subtly. He started handling paperwork, managing accounts, reviewing documents before I saw them. At the time, I appreciated the help. Retirement had left me feeling overwhelmed by financial decisions. Richard always seemed happy to take care of things. Now I wondered if that had been intentional. The realization terrified me. How many documents had I signed recently? How many forms had I trusted him to explain? How many decisions had I handed over simply because I believed he loved me? By midnight, I had accumulated dozens of recordings, enough evidence to confirm the affair. Enough evidence to prove Richard had repeatedly brought Vanessa into my beach house. Enough evidence to show they were planning a future there. But one question remained unanswered. How exactly did Richard intend to get control of Seabreeze Cottage? Because despite everything, one fact still bothered me. The house wasn't a normal asset. Its ownership structure was complicated. My mother had spent years making sure it would remain protected. Richard knew that. At least, I thought he did. So why was he acting as if ownership could simply be transferred? Why was he so confident? Why was Vanessa so confident? The next morning, I finally shut my laptop and tried to clear my head. I stood in the kitchen making coffee when I heard Richard's truck pull into the driveway. My pulse immediately quickened. He walked through the front door carrying a paper bag from my favorite bakery. The smell of fresh cinnamon rolls filled the room. He smiled when he saw me. "Morning, sweetheart." Sweetheart. The word almost made me laugh. Or cry. I wasn't sure which. He crossed the kitchen and kissed my cheek. The same man who had spent the previous weekend promising my beach house to another woman. The same man who believed I was becoming too forgetful to protect myself. And as I looked into his face, I realized something important. For years, I had assumed Richard was better at lying than I was at noticing. But now that I knew the truth, I could see tiny cracks everywhere, tiny signs, tiny tells. And for the first time, I decided to lie back. I smiled, accepted the pastry, thanked him, and pretended I knew absolutely nothing. Because if Richard was planning something involving paperwork, signatures, and my beach house, I intended to find out exactly what it was before he realized I was watching. For the next several days, I played the role of a trusting wife. It was one of the hardest things I had ever done. Every time Richard smiled at me across the breakfast table, I saw the footage from Seabreeze Cottage. Every time he kissed my forehead before leaving for work, I remembered him wrapping his arms around Vanessa. Every time he asked how my day was going, I wondered whether he was secretly calculating how much longer it would take before he could push me out of my own life. But I never let him see any of that. I smiled. I nodded. I thanked him for dinner, and I waited, because one thing had become very clear. Richard was planning something, and if I was patient enough, eventually he would show me exactly what it was. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 3 days after discovering the footage, Richard came home carrying a bouquet of yellow roses, my favorite flowers. Or at least they used to be. Now they felt like props in a performance. "These are beautiful," I said. He smiled. "I thought you deserved something nice." That alone made me suspicious. Richard wasn't normally a flower-buying husband. Not anymore. In the early years of our marriage, yes, but over the last decade, almost never. Yet suddenly he was arriving home with roses. That evening he suggested dinner at a waterfront restaurant we hadn't visited in years. The entire night felt strange, not bad. Just unusually perfect. Too perfect. Richard listened attentively. Asked about my retirement projects. Complimented my appearance. Even held my hand across the table. If I hadn't known about Vanessa, I might have found the evening romantic. Instead, I found it unsettling, because every word felt rehearsed, like he was preparing me for something. When dessert arrived, I finally saw what that something was. Richard reached into a leather portfolio and removed a stack of papers. My stomach tightened immediately. There it was, the paperwork. The thing Vanessa had mentioned in the video. The thing Richard believed I would sign without understanding. He slid the documents toward me. Nothing exciting, he said casually. Just some financial housekeeping. I forced myself to remain calm. What kind of housekeeping? He shrugged. Insurance updates. His answer came too quickly. And taxes. Another quick answer. And some estate planning. 3 different explanations in less than 10 seconds. That was my first clue he was lying. I picked up the first page. Years of teaching had trained me to read carefully. I wasn't an attorney. I wasn't an accountant. But I knew how to analyze documents. And immediately, something felt wrong. The paperwork was dense, complicated, filled with legal language, exactly the sort of thing many people skim before signing, especially someone who trusts the person sitting across from them. I slowly turned pages. Richard watched me carefully. Too carefully. His smile never disappeared, but I noticed his fingers tapping against the table. A nervous habit, one I had seen many times over the years. Whenever he wanted something, whenever he was hiding something. Tap, tap, tap. Then I saw a familiar name. Not Vanessa Reed. Not directly, but close enough. One of the documents referenced a property management company I recognized from earlier research. The company had business ties to Vanessa's real estate network. The moment I saw it, alarm bells started ringing. I looked up. What does this company have to do with our finances? Richard barely hesitated. Oh, that's just a consultant. A consultant. The answer sounded vague, unprepared, weak. I nodded as if satisfied, then continued reading. The deeper I went, the more uncomfortable I became. Not because I fully understood everything, because I didn't, but because the documents contained far more authority than Richard had implied. There were references to asset transfers, authorization rights, property management decisions, financial control provisions, far beyond a simple insurance update, far beyond taxes, far beyond routine paperwork. Richard suddenly leaned forward. You don't need to read every page. I looked at him. Why not? He laughed. Because it'll take all night. The statement hit me harder than he realized. He didn't want me reading. He wanted me signing. A huge difference. I slowly closed the folder. I'd rather review everything first. For the first time that evening, his smile disappeared. Only for a second. Most people wouldn't have noticed. But I did. A flash of irritation crossed his face. Gone almost immediately. Then the pleasant husband mask returned. Of course, his voice remained calm. Take your time. But I could see disappointment in his eyes. He had expected a signature, not questions, not caution, not delay. The rest of dinner felt strained. Richard kept trying to steer the conversation toward retirement planning, toward simplifying responsibilities, toward making life easier. Each topic somehow circled back to the same message. Trust me. Let me handle things. You don't need to worry. Unfortunately for him, I had already started worrying. A lot. That night, after he fell asleep, I carried the folder downstairs. I locked myself in the home office and carefully photographed every page, every signature line, every attachment, every note. Then I uploaded copies to cloud storage, sent backups to a secure email account, saved additional copies to an external drive. If Richard was planning something illegal, I wasn't going to lose evidence. Around midnight, I finally began reviewing the documents more carefully. The more I read, the colder I felt. Certain sections referenced authority over financial accounts. Others appeared to grant representation rights under specific circumstances. One section mentioned residential property interests. Another referenced occupancy arrangements. The language was complicated enough to confuse most people. Maybe that was the point. I suddenly remembered Vanessa's question from the footage. What if she reads it? Richard's answer echoed in my head. Carla trusts me. At that moment, I realized something painful. Richard's greatest weapon wasn't intelligence. It wasn't money. It wasn't charm. It was the trust I'd given him. Trust accumulated over 23 years. Trust built through thousands of ordinary moments. Trust he was now trying to exploit. The realization hurt more than the affair. Because affairs happen. People cheat. People lie. But weaponizing trust feels different. It feels personal, calculated, cruel. The next morning brought another disturbing discovery. I met my friend Donna Mills for coffee. Donna and I had known each other for nearly 30 years. If anyone could tell when something was wrong, it was her. Halfway through our conversation, she frowned. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Sure." Donna stirred her coffee. "Why does Richard keep telling people you're becoming forgetful?" The question hit me like a punch. I tried to stay calm. "What do you mean?" Donna looked uncomfortable. "I've heard him mention it several times lately." A cold sensation spread through my chest. Several times. Not once. Several. What exactly has he been saying? Donna hesitated, then spoke carefully. "He says you're struggling with memory issues." I stared at her. "He said that," Donna nodded. He sounded concerned. Concerned, not concerned. Strategic. Suddenly, dozens of recent conversations made sense. Richard wasn't simply criticizing me at home. He was building a narrative, a story, one where Carla Gibson was aging. Confused, forgetful, dependent, a woman who needed help managing important decisions, a woman who might sign documents without understanding them, a woman whose judgment could be questioned. I felt physically ill. Because this was bigger than I thought. Much bigger. The paperwork wasn't the beginning of the plan. It was the final stage. The groundwork had already been laid. Months, maybe years. And Richard had been quietly preparing everyone around us to believe it. When I returned home that afternoon, Richard was waiting in the kitchen. He smiled warmly. "Did you have a good morning?" I looked into his eyes. The eyes of the man I'd shared a bed with for 23 years. The eyes of the man slowly convincing people I couldn't trust my own mind. And for the first time, genuine fear replaced my anger, because I finally understood something. Richard wasn't just trying to take my beach house. He was trying to convince the world that I was too confused to stop him. For the first few days after my conversation with Donna, I couldn't stop thinking about what she had said. Why does Richard keep telling people you're becoming forgetful? The question echoed through my mind constantly. At first, I tried to convince myself that maybe Richard's comments came from genuine concern. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe discovering the affair had made me suspicious of everything. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Richard wasn't worried about me. He was creating a version of me, a version that served his plans. And once I started paying attention, I saw evidence everywhere. The first incident happened the following Monday. I was getting ready for a dentist appointment. I had placed my car keys on the kitchen counter the night before. I remembered doing it clearly. Yet when I went to leave, the keys were gone. I searched the kitchen. Nothing. The living room. Nothing. The bedroom. Nothing. 20 minutes later, I found them inside a cabinet in the laundry room, a place I had absolutely no reason to put them. When Richard came home that evening, he shook his head sympathetically. "You've really got to start keeping better track of things." His tone sounded concerned, helpful, patient, the perfect husband, at least on the surface. I laughed awkwardly and let it go. But something about the situation bothered me. The next incident happened 3 days later. I had written a reminder note about a lunch date with Donna. I placed it on the refrigerator. The next morning, the note was gone. Completely gone. I searched the entire kitchen. Nothing. As a result, I forgot the lunch. Donna called me that afternoon. "Everything okay?" I immediately felt guilty. I never missed appointments, especially not with her. When I apologized, she sounded surprised. "That's strange. What is—" "You seemed excited about it yesterday." After we hung up, I found the missing note inside a drawer beneath Richard's desk. A drawer I had never opened before. That was when my concern started turning into fear. Not fear of Richard, fear of myself. Because no matter how suspicious I became, a tiny voice kept asking the same question. What if he isn't moving things? What if you're actually forgetting at 64? I wasn't immune to self-doubt. Neither are most people my age. Every misplaced item, every forgotten appointment, every repeated story, they can make you wonder, especially when someone constantly points them out. And Richard pointed them out all the time. One evening we attended a neighborhood barbecue. A group of friends stood around discussing travel plans. I began telling a story about a trip I had taken with my mother years ago. Halfway through, Richard interrupted. "You already told everyone that story." People laughed politely. I laughed too, but something felt off. Not because he corrected me, because of how quickly he did it, how eager he seemed, almost as if he wanted everyone to notice. Later that night, I overheard him speaking privately with another couple. "I worry about Carla." His voice was low, concerned, convincing. "She's forgetting more than she admits." I stood frozen behind a partially open doorway, listening, watching. The husband nodded sympathetically. His wife looked concerned. And Richard continued to carefully planting seeds. Tiny seeds. Just enough to create doubt. Not enough to sound cruel. Not enough to sound manipulative. Just enough to shape perceptions. That realization terrified me, because I suddenly understood how effective his strategy was. Nobody suspected him. Why would they? He wasn't insulting me. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't calling me incompetent. He was acting concerned, loving, protective, the kind of husband people admired. And that made him dangerous. A week later, I decided to start documenting everything. Every missing item, every strange event, every conversation. I bought a notebook and hid it inside a locked suitcase. Each entry included dates and times. At first, I felt ridiculous, like some paranoid detective in a bad television drama. But within days, patterns started emerging. Objects disappeared only when Richard had access to them. Appointments were altered only after he handled the calendar. Messages went missing only when he used shared devices. The evidence wasn't dramatic, but it was consistent. Very consistent. Then came the incident that changed everything. One Saturday morning, I left my reading glasses on the bedside table. I specifically remembered placing them there. Later that afternoon, they vanished. I searched the entire house. Nothing. Richard watched me search, calmly, patiently, almost too patiently. Finally, after nearly an hour, he found them. Inside a storage bin in the garage, a sealed storage bin, behind several boxes, a location I hadn't accessed in months. He held up the glasses. There they are. Then he smiled. A small smile. Barely noticeable. But enough. Enough to trigger something deep inside me. Because for the first time I wasn't confused. I was certain, absolutely certain. I had not put those glasses there. Richard had, and he knew it. That evening I called Donna. I didn't tell her everything. Not yet. I wasn't ready. But I did ask a question. Do you think I'm losing my memory? The silence lasted several seconds. Then she laughed. Not mockingly. Genuinely. Carla, you remember details from conversations 20 years ago. I smiled weakly. That's not an answer. It is an answer. Then her voice softened. Why are you asking? I hesitated. Finally, I told her some of what had been happening. The missing keys, the notes, the glasses, the comments, the interruptions. When I finished, Donna remained silent for a long moment. Then she said something I will never forget. Carla, I don't think you're forgetting things. My heart pounded. What do you think? I think someone wants you to believe you're forgetting things. The words hit me like a lightning strike, because they confirmed what I had been afraid to say aloud. Someone wants you to believe. Not everyone else. You, me. The target wasn't our neighbors, or our friends, or our family. The target was my confidence, my trust in my own mind. If Richard could convince me that I was becoming confused, he wouldn't need to force me into anything. I would surrender control voluntarily. The realization made me physically sick. That night, after Richard fell asleep, I did something I had never done before. I checked his computer. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted proof of the affair. Because I wanted answers. I waited until I heard him snoring, then quietly entered his home office. His laptop wasn't locked. Another sign of his confidence. Another sign that he believed I wasn't paying attention. I began searching. Emails, downloads, recent files. Nothing obvious at first. Then I found a folder. Its title appeared harmless. Retirement planning. Inside were dozens of documents. Some financial, some legal, some medical. My pulse accelerated. I opened file after file. And then I found the words that made my blood run cold. Guardianship, cognitive decline, financial authority, power of attorney, protective oversight. I stared at the screen, unable to move, unable to breathe. Richard had been researching legal pathways for gaining control over someone deemed mentally incapable of managing their affairs. My hands shook. I opened another file, then another, then another. Everything pointed in the same direction. Not a single document proved wrongdoing, but collectively, they painted a terrifying picture. A man studying how to take control, a man building a narrative, a man preparing paperwork, a man telling everyone his wife was becoming forgetful. Suddenly, the affair seemed almost secondary. Vanessa wasn't the biggest threat. The real threat was Richard's plan. And for the first time, I realized how close I might have come to falling into it. I quietly closed the laptop, returned upstairs, and sat alone in the darkness of my bedroom. Richard slept peacefully beside me, completely unaware that I had just uncovered another piece of the truth. I stared at the ceiling until sunrise, because one thing was now painfully clear. Richard wasn't simply trying to take my beach house. He was preparing to convince the world that I was no longer capable of protecting it. And if I wanted to stop him, I was going to need help. Real help. The kind of help Richard never expected me to seek. There was only one person who might know exactly how protected Seabreeze Cottage truly was. A woman I hadn't spoken to in years. The attorney who had helped my mother arrange everything before she died. Linda Harper. And the next morning, I picked up the phone. I called Linda Harper at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly 8 years. The last time we'd met was shortly after my mother's funeral. At the time, I assumed most of the legal work surrounding my mother's estate had been completed. Life moved on. I retired. Megan built her own family. And Linda gradually became one of those people connected to a chapter of life that seemed permanently closed. Or so I thought. When she answered the phone, her voice sounded exactly the same. Steady, calm, confident. Linda Harper speaking. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Too much had happened in too little time. Finally, I said, "Linda?" "It's Carla Gibson." A brief pause followed. Then warmth entered her voice. "Carla, it's been a long time." "It has." "How are you?" I almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the question felt impossible to answer. How was I? My husband was having an affair. He appeared to be building a case that I was mentally declining. He was trying to manipulate me into signing documents I didn't understand. And he had promised my beloved beach house to another woman. Other than that, everything was wonderful. I'm not sure how to answer that. Linda immediately became serious. "What's happened?" I glanced around the empty kitchen. Even though Richard was at work, I lowered my voice. "I think I need legal advice." Silence. Then Linda asked a question that surprised me. "Does this involve Richard?" My stomach tightened. "Why would you ask that?" "Because if you're calling me after 8 years asking for legal advice, it's probably either Richard or money. despite everything. I smiled. Actually, it might be both. An hour later, I was sitting in Linda's office. I had brought everything: copies of the videos, photographs of the documents Richard wanted me to sign, notes from my journal, screenshots, emails, every piece of evidence I had collected. Linda reviewed everything carefully. Unlike me, she never reacted emotionally. She simply observed, analyzed, connected facts. Occasionally she made notes. Occasionally she asked questions. After nearly 90 minutes, she finally leaned back in her chair. "What concerns you most?" The answer came immediately. "Seabreeze Cottage." Linda nodded. "Tell me why." I swallowed hard. "Because Richard thinks he can take it." For the first time, Linda frowned. Not worried. Confused. "Take it." "That's what he's planning." I described the camera footage. Richard's promises to Vanessa, the discussions about ownership, the renovation plans, the comments about me signing paperwork, everything. Linda listened without interrupting. When I finished, she removed her glasses. Then she said something completely unexpected. "That doesn't make any sense." My heart sank. "What do you mean? Legally?" I stared at her. "What are you talking about?" Linda opened a drawer, removed a thick file, placed it on the desk. The sight of my mother's name typed neatly across the tab immediately caught my attention. Evelyn Carter Estate Planning. I hadn't seen that file in years. Linda opened it, flipped through pages, then stopped at a specific document. "Carla, Seabreeze Cottage doesn't belong to you." For several seconds, I simply stared at her. Then confusion replaced panic. "What?" "It doesn't." I blinked. "Of course it belongs to me." Linda shook her head gently. "No." Then she slid a document across the desk. "It belongs to a trust." I looked down. The paperwork felt strangely familiar. Certain details triggered distant memories. Conversations with my mother before her death. Meetings with attorneys. Documents I had signed years earlier. Things I hadn't thought about in a very long time. Linda pointed to a section of the trust agreement. "Your mother established an irrevocable trust." I nodded slowly. Pieces began returning. "I remember that." "Good," Linda continued. "The trust owns Seabreeze Cottage." I frowned. "But I've been maintaining it for years." "Yes." "I pay expenses." "Yes." "I use it whenever I want." "Yes." Linda smiled slightly. "Because you have lifetime occupancy rights." I sat quietly, listening, trying to reconnect with legal decisions made decades ago. Linda continued explaining. "Your mother was worried." "Worried about what?" "The future." Linda tapped the document. "She wanted to ensure the property stayed in the family." That sounded exactly like my mother. Practical, protective, always planning 10 steps ahead. "So what does that mean now?" Linda turned several pages. Then she pointed to another section. My eyes widened, because I recognized two names immediately. Megan Turner, Emily Turner, my daughter, my granddaughter. I looked up. Linda nodded. "They are the successor beneficiaries." I stared at her, unable to speak. Suddenly everything felt unreal. The beach house wasn't passing through me. It was passing beyond me. To Megan. Then Emily. Just as my mother intended. "Richard has no ownership interest whatsoever," Linda said. I felt a wave of relief. Powerful. Overwhelming. But it lasted only a few seconds, because another question quickly followed. If that's true, Linda already knew what I was going to ask. Then why is he acting like he can take it? Exactly. She folded her hands. That's the interesting question. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Linda stood, walked toward a filing cabinet, opened another drawer. After searching for several moments, she returned carrying an older folder. Much older. The paper inside had yellowed slightly with age. Linda placed it in front of me. You need to see this. I looked down. At first, I didn't understand what I was reading. Then I saw the date. 23 years earlier, just before Richard and I married. My pulse quickened. What is this? Linda smiled. A document your future husband signed. I immediately leaned closer. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Richard Gibson. Linda pointed to the text. Before your marriage, Richard signed a formal waiver. I read the paragraph once, then twice, then a third time. Each reading made the meaning clearer. Richard acknowledged that Seabreeze Cottage belonged to the trust. Richard acknowledged he had no ownership rights. Richard acknowledged he would never claim ownership rights in the future. Richard voluntarily waived any potential marital interest. The room suddenly felt very quiet. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from disbelief. You're telling me? Linda nodded. Yes. He signed this himself. Yes. He knew. Absolutely. I stared at the signature. Richard's signature. The same signature that appeared on tax returns, Christmas cards, business documents. The same signature he used every day. There was no denying it, no explaining it away, no misunderstanding. Richard knew. From the very beginning. He knew the house wasn't his. He knew it could never become his. And yet he was still promising it to Vanessa. I suddenly remembered every confident statement from the videos. The house will be ours. We'll live here. Everything you don't like can go. The certainty, the arrogance, the entitlement, all of it built on a lie. A lie Richard himself should have known was impossible. Linda watched me carefully. What are you thinking? I laughed softly. A bitter laugh. I think my husband is either incredibly stupid or incredibly desperate. Possibly both. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to hope. Not happiness. Not relief. Hope. Because the foundation of Richard's plan suddenly looked far weaker than I imagined. The beach house itself was protected. Legally protected. By documents created long before Vanessa entered the picture. Long before Richard started talking about my memory. Long before he started pushing suspicious paperwork toward me. My mother had protected Seabreeze Cottage from exactly this kind of situation. Even from beyond the grave. Then Linda's expression became serious again. Carla. What? Don't get comfortable yet. The warning immediately erased my brief sense of victory. What do you mean? Linda leaned forward. The house may be protected. My stomach tightened. But Richard clearly believes he can accomplish something. The room became silent. Linda tapped the stack of documents Richard wanted me to sign. If a man knows he can't legally own a property, she paused. And still spends months trying to obtain control over it. I felt cold all over. Then he's planning something else. Linda nodded. Exactly. And suddenly, For the first time, I realized the most frightening possibility of all. Maybe Seabreeze Cottage wasn't Richard's real target. Maybe it was me. I left Linda Harper's office carrying two things. The first was a folder containing copies of every document related to Seabreeze Cottage. The second was a growing sense of guilt, not because of Richard, because of Megan. For years, I had believed a story that now seemed less believable with every passing day. According to Richard, Megan had gradually drifted away because she was selfish, too busy, too focused on her own life, too uninterested in maintaining a relationship. Whenever I complained that Megan rarely visited, Richard always had an explanation. Whenever I felt hurt because she didn't call, Richard had an explanation. Whenever birthdays passed with little communication, Richard had an explanation. There was always an explanation, and I had accepted every one of them. Now I wasn't sure any of them were true. Linda's words echoed in my mind during the drive home. Megan and Emily are the beneficiaries. Not Richard, not me. Megan and Emily. Which meant one thing. If Richard wanted control over Seabreeze Cottage, Megan represented an obstacle, a very important obstacle. And suddenly, I couldn't stop wondering whether the distance between my daughter and me had happened naturally, or whether someone had helped create it. By the time I reached my driveway, I had already made a decision. I needed to speak with Megan. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Immediately. The problem was that I hadn't had a meaningful conversation with my daughter in almost 3 years. We exchanged holiday texts, occasional birthday messages, brief phone calls, nothing more. The closeness we once shared had slowly disappeared, and now I wasn't sure how much of that loss was my fault. The thought terrified me. I sat in my car for nearly 10 minutes staring at my phone. What if she didn't answer? What if she was angry? What if Richard had been telling the truth all along? Eventually, I forced myself to dial her number. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then I heard her voice. Mom, just one word. Yet hearing it almost brought me to tears. I hadn't realized how much I missed her. Hi, sweetheart. Silence followed. Not hostile silence. Surprised silence. Then Megan spoke. Is everything okay? The question immediately hurt, because it revealed something important. My daughter wasn't expecting a casual call from me. She assumed something had to be wrong. That realization alone said a lot about how far apart we'd grown. I actually wanted to talk. Another pause. Then she said quietly, I'd like that. The conversation started awkwardly. Two people who loved each other but no longer knew how to communicate. We discussed work, her husband, Emily's school activities, the weather, anything except what really mattered. Finally, I took a deep breath. Megan, can I ask you something? Of course. Have I done something to hurt you? Silence. Longer this time. Painful. When she finally answered, her voice sounded different, softer, more emotional. Why are you asking me that? Because I feel like I've lost you. The words came out before I could stop them. And the moment they did, tears filled my eyes. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I heard something unexpected. Megan was crying too. Mom, her voice broke. I thought I lost you. The sentence hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean? I thought you stopped wanting me in your life. I couldn't speak. Nothing about that statement made sense. Why would you think that? Megan laughed sadly. Because that's what it felt like. I leaned forward in my chair, heart pounding. Explain. What happened next changed everything. Over the next 40 minutes, Megan told me a story completely different from the one Richard had spent years feeding me. According to Megan, she had repeatedly tried to stay close. She had called, visited, invited me to holidays, invited me to Emily's school events, sent emails, sent messages, reached out over and over. At first, I assumed there had simply been scheduling conflicts, then misunderstandings, then growing distance. But Megan described something entirely different. A pattern. A strange pattern. Messages that went unanswered. Phone calls that were never returned. Invitations that received cold responses. Eventually, she concluded that I no longer wanted much contact. And honestly, listening to her, I couldn't blame her, because from her perspective, that's exactly how it looked. Mom, do you remember Emily's 8th birthday? I frowned. Of course. You canceled. I stared at the wall. No, I didn't. Megan went quiet. Richard called. My stomach tightened. What? He said you weren't feeling well. I felt suddenly cold. I never told him to do that. I know. The answer surprised me. You do, Megan sighed. At the time, I believed him. She paused. But things like that kept happening. The room seemed to shrink around me. One memory after another surfaced. Missed visits, canceled plans, confusing misunderstandings, arguments that never made sense. Had Richard been involved in all of them, the possibility felt overwhelming. Then Megan mentioned something else, something even worse. Do you remember the email you sent me 3 years ago? I frowned. What email? Silence. Then she read part of it aloud. The words felt unfamiliar immediately. Cold, dismissive, cruel. Nothing like me. The email supposedly stated that Megan was becoming too dependent, that she needed to stop involving herself in my life, that I wanted more space, that I was tired of feeling pressured. I sat frozen, because I had never written those words, not once, not ever. I didn't send that. Megan didn't respond right away. Then she said quietly, I know that now. A chill ran through my body. Now. Not then. Now. Something had happened. Something that changed her mind. What made you realize that? Megan hesitated, then answered carefully. Because over the last year, a few things stopped adding up. My pulse accelerated. What things, Richard? Of course, Richard. Always Richard. Megan explained that she had gradually become suspicious after several interactions with him. His stories changed. His explanations contradicted previous explanations. His timeline of events often didn't make sense. Eventually, she stopped trusting what he said. But by then, so much damage had already been done. Years of damage. Years neither of us knew how to repair. Tears rolled down my face. Not because of Richard, because of everything we had lost. Birthday parties, Christmas gatherings, ordinary weekends, conversations, memories, time. The one thing nobody ever gets back. I should have called more, I whispered. No. Megan's voice immediately became firm. You don't get to carry all of this. I closed my eyes. I should have fought harder. We both should have. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Megan asked a question. One simple question. The kind only a daughter can ask. Mom, What's really going on? I looked toward the window. Thought about the affair. The paperwork. The trust. Vanessa. Linda. Everything. Then I realized I was tired of carrying it alone. So for the first time, I told her the truth. Not part of it. All of it. When I finished, the line remained silent. Then Megan spoke, and her voice carried something I hadn't heard in years. Protectiveness. Determination. Love. Mom. Yes. You're not facing this by yourself anymore. The tears came harder then, because for the first time since discovering Richard's betrayal, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt supported. I felt like a mother who had found her daughter again. Then Megan said something that made my stomach drop. There's something else you need to know. What? Another pause, a hesitant one. The kind people make when they're deciding whether to reveal something painful. Finally, she spoke. Richard didn't just interfere with our relationship. My pulse quickened. What do you mean? Her answer changed everything. Mom? I think he's been lying to both of us for years. After my conversation with Megan, I sat in my living room for nearly an hour without moving. The house was quiet, too quiet. For years, I had believed I was losing my daughter. Now I was beginning to understand that someone had been standing between us the entire time. Richard. The realization hurt more than discovering the affair, because affairs destroy marriages. But what Richard had done to Megan and me was different. He hadn't simply betrayed me. He had stolen years of birthdays, years of family dinners, years of ordinary moments that can never be replaced. I found myself staring at an old photograph sitting on the bookshelf. It showed Megan at 12 years old, her hair blowing in the ocean wind. Emily wasn't even born yet. Daniel was still alive, and Seabreeze Cottage stood in the background. Looking at that photograph strengthened something inside me. For weeks, I had been reacting, discovering, learning, surviving. But now I wanted answers, real answers, and I knew exactly where to find them. Richard's home office. The following morning, I waited until Richard left for work. As usual, he kissed my cheek before leaving. As usual, I smiled and pretended everything was normal. The front door closed. His truck backed out of the driveway. 5 minutes later, I was standing inside his office. I closed the door behind me, locked it, then took a deep breath. The room looked ordinary enough. A large desk, bookshelves, framed certificates, business awards, photographs from company events. Nothing about it suggested deception. But I knew better now. Richard's lies were rarely obvious. They were buried beneath layers of normality. I began with the filing cabinet beside his desk. The first drawer contained business records, invoices, contracts, tax documents. Nothing unusual. The second drawer contained employee information. Again, nothing immediately suspicious. Then I reached the bottom drawer, locked. That immediately caught my attention. Richard rarely locked anything, not because he trusted people, because he preferred appearing trustworthy. The lock itself was simple, and after 23 years of marriage, I knew where Richard kept spare keys. 5 minutes later, I was opening the drawer. My pulse accelerated. Inside were several thick folders. Some carried company labels. Others were completely unmarked. I selected one at random. The moment I opened it, I knew I had found something important. The folder contained property records. Not business properties. Residential properties. My stomach tightened. Several pages later, I found the address. Seabreeze Cottage. I slowly sat down. Every instinct told me to proceed carefully. Inside the folder were photographs, appraisal reports, property surveys, renovation estimates, financial projections. Page after page dedicated entirely to my beach house. Not our beach house. My beach house. The house Richard supposedly didn't care about. The house he claimed was only important because it mattered to me. The lie became more obvious with every page. For years, he had been obsessively tracking its value. The most recent appraisal made my eyes widen. The property was worth considerably more than I realized. The North Carolina coast had experienced a surge in real estate prices. Seabreeze Cottage wasn't just sentimental. It was valuable. Extremely valuable. Suddenly, Richard's interest made even more sense. I continued reading. Then I discovered something even worse. A draft purchase agreement. The buyer listed wasn't Vanessa Reed, at least not directly. Instead, the buyer was a limited liability company, a newly formed LLC. At first glance, it appeared unrelated. But years of teaching literature had trained me to notice details, small details. And something about the company address looked familiar. Very familiar. I immediately took photographs of every page, then sent copies to myself. Afterward, I called Linda. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in her office again. She reviewed the documents carefully. Her expression darkened. Interesting. What is Linda pointed to the company address? This company isn't independent. I leaned forward. What do you mean? She rotated the document toward me. The address belonged to a commercial building downtown, the same building where Vanessa operated her real estate office. A chill moved through my body. So Vanessa owns the company. Possibly. Linda continued reviewing records. A few minutes later, she found additional information. The LLC had been established less than a year earlier. Almost no operating history. Almost no assets. Yet somehow it was preparing to acquire a multi-million-dollar beachfront property. That's not suspicious at all, I muttered. Linda smiled grimly. No, it isn't. The sarcasm was obvious. The implications were worse. Richard wasn't planning to hand the property directly to Vanessa. He was attempting to route ownership through a shell company, a company connected to her, a company designed to hide who would ultimately benefit. The deeper we dug, the uglier the picture became. Then Linda noticed something else, a series of financial records tucked inside the folder. Her expression immediately changed. What is it? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she handed me several statements. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then realization hit me. Retirement accounts, joint accounts, investment accounts, my accounts, our accounts. Large withdrawals appeared throughout the records. Thousands of dollars. Then tens of thousands. Then even larger amounts. I stared at the numbers, unable to process them. Richard transferred this money. Linda nodded. It appears so. My hands began shaking. The withdrawal stretched back nearly 2 years, carefully spaced, carefully timed, small enough individually to avoid attention, large enough collectively to create serious damage. I felt sick. Where did it go? Linda continued reviewing documentation. A few minutes later, she found the answer. Some funds had been directed toward business debts, others toward credit accounts, others toward payments connected to Vanessa. Trips, luxury purchases, renovation deposits, consulting fees. The exact labels varied. The result did not. Richard had been financing another life, using money from our marriage. For several moments, I couldn't speak. The affair suddenly looked much larger than I originally believed. This wasn't romance. This wasn't passion. This wasn't some late-life love story. This was financial exploitation. Pure and simple. Richard had been extracting resources from one life to fund another. And he had done it while convincing me I was becoming incapable of managing my own affairs. The hypocrisy made me furious. Linda eventually broke the silence. "Carla." I looked up. "We need to be smart." I nodded slowly. "What do you suggest?" Her answer surprised me. "Do nothing." I stared at her. "What?" "For now." That seemed impossible. I wanted confrontation, justice, consequences, immediately. But Linda shook her head. "Not yet." She leaned forward. "Right now, Richard believes he's winning." I understood what she meant. "He thinks I'm still clueless." "Exactly." Linda folded her hands. "And that's useful." The room became quiet. Because she was right. Richard didn't know I had discovered the affair. He didn't know I had spoken with Megan. He didn't know I had met with Linda. He didn't know I had found the financial records. And most importantly, he didn't know I understood his plan was failing. That ignorance was an advantage, a powerful advantage. Linda continued, "We need evidence of intent. We already have evidence." "Not enough," I frowned. "What else do we need?" Linda's answer made my stomach tighten. "We need him to show us exactly what he's trying to make you sign." The room suddenly felt colder. Because I knew she was right. The documents Richard had already presented were only part of the picture. There was something bigger coming. Something he had spent months preparing. Something he believed would finally give him control. And if we wanted to stop him completely, we needed him to reveal it. I stared out the office window, thinking about Richard, thinking about Vanessa, thinking about Seabreeze Cottage. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me all afternoon. What if he realizes I know? Linda's expression remained calm. "He won't." "How can you be sure?" A faint smile appeared on her face. "Because men like Richard always make the same mistake." "What mistake?" Linda leaned back. "They confuse trust with weakness." For the first time in days, I smiled, because she was absolutely right. Richard thought I trusted him because I was naive. Because I was dependent. Because I couldn't see through him. He never considered another possibility. That the woman he underestimated might be quietly preparing a trap of her own. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I started thinking about something other than survival. I started thinking about strategy. The strangest part about discovering the truth was how quickly fear transformed into patience. A month earlier, if I had uncovered evidence of Richard's affair, I would have confronted him immediately. I would have demanded answers. I would have cried, yelled, thrown him out of the house. But now I understood something I hadn't understood before. Richard wasn't simply cheating. He was planning, manipulating, positioning pieces on a chessboard. And if I wanted to protect myself, I needed to stop reacting emotionally and start thinking strategically. That was exactly what Linda kept telling me. 3 days after we discovered the financial records, Linda arranged a private meeting. Present were only 4 people: Linda, me, Megan, and a forensic financial investigator named Thomas Reynolds. Thomas was a quiet man in his late 50s with silver hair and an intimidating ability to notice details. Within 30 minutes of reviewing the documents, he reached the same conclusion Linda had. Richard believes he's close. I frowned. What makes you say that? Thomas pointed toward a timeline he had created. The chart showed account transfers, property research, legal document preparation, business filings. Everything stretched across nearly 3 years. The pattern was unmistakable. The activity increased dramatically during the past 6 months, then even more during the past 3 months, and during the previous few weeks, it had accelerated again. Thomas folded his hands. People become careless when they think they're about to win. The statement lingered in the room, because all of us knew exactly who he meant. Richard. Megan leaned forward. So what do we do? Linda answered immediately. We let him think he's winning. I looked at her. The strategy made sense, but it still felt dangerous. What if he succeeds before we stop him? He won't. Linda's confidence remained unshaken. Not if we control the timing. Thomas nodded. The key is getting him to reveal his final move. I already knew what they meant. The paperwork, the signatures, the mysterious documents Richard wanted me to sign. Whatever he was planning, those documents sat at the center of it. And we needed to know exactly how far he was willing to go. That afternoon, we developed a plan. Simple, risky, effective. I would stop resisting, not completely. Just enough. Instead of questioning Richard, I would become cooperative. Instead of delaying, I would become agreeable. Instead of acting suspicious, I would become trusting. In short, I would become exactly the woman Richard believed I was. The woman he underestimated. The woman he thought he controlled. The thought made me uncomfortable, but it was necessary. For the first time in weeks, I walked into the house knowing exactly what role I needed to play. Richard came home around 6. He looked tired, distracted. Yet the moment he saw me smiling, something changed. Hope flashed across his face. The kind of hope a gambler feels when the odds suddenly improve. "Good day," he asked. Actually, yes. His eyebrows lifted slightly. That's nice. I poured him coffee, sat across from him, then carefully delivered the first piece of bait. I've been thinking about those documents. His attention sharpened immediately, almost imperceptibly, but I noticed. What about them? I shrugged casually. Maybe you're right. The room became very still. About what? Making things simpler. For a moment, Richard didn't speak. Then a slow smile appeared. Not too large, not too eager, but definitely there. I've been saying that for years. I nodded. Maybe retirement has made me realize I don't want to deal with complicated financial decisions anymore. The lie tasted bitter. But it worked. I could practically see the relief spreading through him. Over the next several days, I continued feeding that impression. Small comments, carefully chosen observations. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to convince him I was becoming more dependent, more trusting, more willing to let him take charge. And Richard responded exactly as Linda predicted. He became warmer, friendlier, more attentive. Flowers appeared again. Dinner invitations returned. Unexpected compliments resurfaced. It felt like watching a salesman become increasingly charming as a deal approached completion. One evening he even suggested a weekend trip. We should spend some time at Seabreeze Cottage. My pulse quickened. There it was, the beach house, the center of everything. I forced myself to remain calm. That sounds nice. Richard smiled. I thought so. The smile lingered longer than usual, almost triumphant. Later that night, I called Linda. He wants to go to the cottage. Silence. Then Linda said exactly what I expected. Good. You think so? Absolutely. I wasn't convinced. It feels dangerous. Because you're thinking emotionally. I sighed. Maybe she was right. Explain. Linda's voice remained calm. If Richard wants the cottage involved, then the cottage matters to the final phase of his plan. The logic was difficult to argue with. He'll be more comfortable there, she continued, more confident. And confidence creates mistakes. After hanging up, I found myself staring out the bedroom window. Richard slept beside me, peaceful, relaxed, completely unaware of the fact that every move he made was now being observed. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, he had treated me like someone easy to manipulate, someone predictable, someone harmless. Now that same assumption was becoming his greatest weakness. The following week brought another development. Richard approached me with a fresh set of documents. Different from the previous ones, thicker, more detailed. He presented them casually during breakfast. Nothing urgent. That statement alone told me they were urgent. Just some updated paperwork. I glanced at the folder, then smiled. Maybe I'll finally sign everything. For the briefest moment, his eyes widened. Victory. Pure victory. Then he quickly composed himself. Only if you're comfortable. Comfortable. The word almost made me laugh. Instead, I nodded. Maybe next weekend. Richard leaned back, trying very hard to appear calm, failing. I could practically hear the gears turning inside his head. Next weekend, at Seabreeze Cottage. Exactly where he wanted this to happen. Exactly where he believed his future with Vanessa would begin. The trap was setting itself. That evening, Thomas called with another update. His investigation into the financial records had uncovered additional irregularities. More unauthorized transfers. More hidden debts. More connections between Richard and Vanessa. The picture was growing uglier and more complete. He's desperate, Thomas said. What makes you think that? Because he's running out of time. I frowned. What do you mean? Thomas explained that several business obligations appeared to be approaching critical deadlines. Loans, debt restructuring agreements, payment schedules, things Richard couldn't postpone forever. The information changed everything. Suddenly, Richard's urgency made sense. The affair wasn't simply about romance. The beach house wasn't simply about greed. He needed something. Something valuable. Something capable of solving multiple problems at once. And he believed Seabreeze Cottage was the answer. The next few days passed slowly, painfully slowly. Richard grew increasingly cheerful, increasingly optimistic, increasingly convinced his plan was succeeding. Meanwhile, Linda, Thomas, Megan, and I continued preparing, collecting, organizing, waiting. Then, 3 days before the trip to Seabreeze Cottage, Richard made a mistake. A small mistake, but an important one. I walked into the kitchen unexpectedly while he was texting. He quickly turned his phone away. Not fast enough. For a split second, I saw the name, Vanessa, and beneath it, a message. Almost all set. Just a few more days. My heart pounded. Because for the first time, I realized how confident they both were. They weren't hoping. They weren't planning. They genuinely believed they had already won. And sometimes, that's exactly when people become most vulnerable. Because when people think victory is guaranteed, they stop protecting themselves. They stop paying attention. They stop imagining failure. That night, after Richard fell asleep, I received a message from Megan. Just 4 words. "We're ready when you are." I stared at the screen, then looked toward the man sleeping beside me. The man who thought he was orchestrating the perfect ending. The man who had spent years manipulating everyone around him. The man who had promised my beach house to his mistress. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't afraid, because Richard had no idea that the game he thought he was winning had already changed. And soon, he was going to walk straight into the trap we had built for him. 3 days before our trip to Seabreeze Cottage, Megan drove to my house carrying 3 cardboard boxes. The moment I saw them in the back seat of her SUV, I knew they contained something important. No one transports 3 boxes with that expression on their face unless they're carrying answers. Or pain. Possibly both. We sat at my kitchen table. Coffee cooled between us. Neither of us spoke immediately. The relationship we were rebuilding still felt fragile. Stronger than it had been a month earlier, but fragile nonetheless. Years of misunderstanding don't disappear overnight. Eventually, Megan pushed the first box toward me. "I think you need to see these." I looked inside. My breath caught. Greeting cards, photographs, letters, packages, small gifts, all addressed to me. Some were opened. Others remained sealed. Most looked old. Very old. I picked up a birthday card. The postmark was nearly 6 years old. Megan. My voice barely worked. "What is all this?" she swallowed. "Things I tried to send?" The room suddenly felt smaller. I opened the card carefully. Inside was a handwritten message. "Mom, Emily made this drawing for you. She's excited to see you at her birthday party next week. Love, Megan." A child's drawing slipped from the envelope. I stared at it, then at the date. Emily had been 8 years old. The same birthday party Richard claimed I had canceled. My chest tightened. I remembered that day. I remembered feeling hurt because I thought Megan hadn't invited me. The invitation had been sitting in a box all along, never reaching me. I looked up. Tears already filled Megan's eyes. I sent dozens of things. My throat burned. Richard never gave them to me. She nodded. No. For several moments, neither of us spoke. I simply continued opening envelopes. Each one felt like discovering a missing piece of my own life. A Christmas card from Emily. A graduation photograph. An invitation to a school performance. A Mother's Day letter. A handmade ornament. Years of memories. Years of attempts to stay connected. Years I thought had never existed. The pain was overwhelming. Because I wasn't simply discovering hidden mail. I was discovering proof. Proof that my daughter had never abandoned me. Proof that she had been trying harder than I ever knew. Finally, I set down another envelope. I don't understand. Megan wiped her eyes. Neither did I. She pointed toward the second box. Open that one. I hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside were printed emails. Dozens of them, organized in folders. Many carried my name. At least, they appeared to. I picked up the first page. The email supposedly came from me. It was addressed to Megan. The message was cold, dismissive, almost cruel. Stop involving me in every family event. I need more space. Please respect my boundaries. I stared at the page. Every sentence felt foreign, not just the wording, the tone, the attitude, the personality. It wasn't me, not even close. I never wrote this. I know. Megan's answer came immediately. I picked up another email, then another, then another. Each one pushed the same message. Distance, detachment, rejection. According to these emails, I didn't want frequent visits. I didn't want family gatherings. I didn't want involvement in Emily's life. The problem was obvious. I adored Emily. Always had. The idea that I would voluntarily pull away from my granddaughter made no sense. Yet if Megan had received these messages, I understood why she felt hurt, why she believed I no longer wanted her around. Because I would have believed it too. My hands trembled as I continued reading. Then I noticed something strange. A tiny detail. One sentence ended with a phrase I had heard before. Not from me, from Richard. I looked at another email, then another. The pattern appeared again. Certain expressions repeated. Certain vocabulary choices repeated. Certain phrases sounded remarkably familiar. Not like Carla Gibson, like Richard Gibson. A chill moved through my body. Megan noticed my expression. You see it too, I nodded slowly. These sound like him. They do. Neither of us wanted to say the obvious conclusion aloud, but it sat there between us anyway. Heavy, unavoidable. Finally, I whispered it. Do you think Richard wrote these? Megan sighed. I think someone did. The statement was careful, measured, but we both knew what she meant. Over the following hour, we examined everything together. Dates, times, messages, patterns. The deeper we looked, the more suspicious things became. Then Megan handed me a printed report. I hired someone last year. I blinked. What? A technology consultant. I stared at her. You investigated this. She nodded. I needed answers. Suddenly I understood. Megan hadn't simply accepted the situation. She had spent years trying to understand it, trying to understand me, trying to understand why her mother seemed to disappear. My heart broke all over again. The report contained metadata from several emails, login information, IP addresses, technical details I barely understood. Fortunately, the conclusion was simple. The emails had not been sent from devices I regularly used. My pulse quickened. What does this mean? Megan pointed to a highlighted section. The login locations? I leaned closer. Then everything clicked. Because I recognized the address immediately. Richard's office, the room where I had recently discovered property records and financial documents, the room where Richard spent countless hours alone, the room connected to almost every mystery in my life. I felt physically ill, not because of surprise, because of confirmation. For weeks, suspicion had haunted me. Now suspicion was becoming evidence. Richard hadn't merely manipulated conversations. He hadn't merely hidden information. He had actively manufactured separation, manufactured conflict, manufactured distance, and he had done it over many years. The realization left me speechless. Megan reached across the table, placed her hand over mine. "Mom?" I looked up. She was crying again. So was I. "I'm sorry." The words escaped before I could stop them. "Megan, I'm so sorry." Immediately she shook her head. "No. I should have known." "No. I should have fought harder." Again she shook her head, this time more firmly. "Mom, stop." I fell silent. Her voice softened. "You were manipulated, too." The statement hit me harder than expected, because for weeks I had focused on Richard's betrayal, his affair, his schemes, his greed. I hadn't fully processed something equally important. I was a victim, too. Not weak, not foolish, manipulated. There is a difference. People like Richard survive by exploiting trust, by isolating people, by controlling information, by creating confusion. And somehow, over the years, he had done exactly that. Not only to me, to Megan as well. The realization hurt, but it also brought clarity. For the first time, neither of us blamed the other. We both understood who had been standing in the middle, who had benefited from the separation, who had encouraged the misunderstanding. Richard. Always Richard. Eventually Megan opened the third box. This one contained photographs, hundreds of them. Emily growing up, school events, dance recitals, birthdays, family vacations, moments I should have witnessed, moments I should have shared, a lifetime compressed into a cardboard container. I smiled through tears while looking at them. Emily at 10, Emily at 12, Emily at 14. Each picture represented time I couldn't recover, but it also represented something else, a future still available, a relationship not permanently lost, a family still worth fighting for. As the afternoon sun faded outside, Megan and I sat together on the couch. The boxes remained scattered around us, evidence of both heartbreak and hope. Then Megan said something that made me sit upright, something I hadn't considered before. "Mom, there's another reason I think Richard wanted us apart." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" She hesitated, then answered quietly, "Because if we stayed close." I waited. "I would have warned you." The room became silent, and suddenly I realized she was right. If Megan and I had remained close, Richard's plans might never have succeeded, because someone who loved me would have noticed. Someone who knew me would have questioned the strange emails, the missing invitations, the financial changes, the personality shifts. Richard didn't just need control over my assets. He needed isolation. And that meant separating me from the one person most likely to expose him, my daughter. For the first time since this nightmare began, I truly understood how long he had been planning, and just how much he had been willing to destroy to get what he wanted. The drive to Seabreeze Cottage felt surreal. Richard was in an excellent mood, almost euphoric. He hummed along to songs on the radio, stopped twice to buy snacks, kept talking about future renovation ideas. Future renovation ideas. The irony nearly made me laugh, because sitting beside him was the one person standing between him and everything he wanted. Me. And for the first time since discovering his betrayal, I wasn't afraid of what would happen next. I was curious. Because after weeks of lies, hidden documents, secret meetings, and manipulation, we had finally arrived at the moment Richard had been working toward. The final stage. I could feel it. So could he. As we crossed the bridge leading toward the coast, I watched him carefully. His excitement wasn't the excitement of a husband enjoying a weekend getaway. It was anticipation. The anticipation of someone expecting a reward. The anticipation of someone convinced success was only hours away. By the time we reached Seabreeze Cottage, the late afternoon sun painted the ocean in shades of gold. Normally, the sight would have brought me peace. This house had always been my sanctuary, the place where life felt simpler, safer. Now it felt like a battlefield. Richard carried luggage inside while I stood on the deck overlooking the water. The waves rolled toward shore exactly as they had throughout my entire life. My father once told me something while standing on this same deck. The ocean teaches patience. At the time, I didn't understand. Now I did. Patience had become my greatest weapon. That evening, Richard grilled dinner while I pretended nothing had changed. We ate on the porch, watched the sunset, made small talk. To an outsider, we probably looked like a happily married couple enjoying retirement. The performance was almost convincing. Almost. Then, after dessert, Richard made his move. He disappeared inside, returned carrying a leather folder. The same folder I had been expecting. The same folder Linda had predicted. The same folder containing whatever Richard believed would finally give him control. There are a few documents I'd like us to finish this weekend. I smiled gently. Of course. His eyes brightened. A fisherman watching a fish swim toward the hook. I accepted the folder, opened it slowly, and immediately understood why he had been so confident. The paperwork looked different from anything he had shown me before. Much more sophisticated. Much more dangerous. Several pages carried legal formatting, professional language, official seals, the kind of documents most people assume are legitimate simply because they appear legitimate. I began reading carefully. Richard sat across from me pretending to relax, but I could feel his attention fixed on every page I turned. The first section discussed financial management authority. The second addressed health-related decision-making. The third concerned asset oversight. My pulse remained steady, because Linda had already prepared me for this possibility. What Richard presented wasn't technically guardianship paperwork. Not yet. It was the foundation. A series of authorizations that would gradually shift decision-making power away from me, piece by piece, right under my nose. I continued reading. Then I found the section that mattered. Property authority. Residential asset administration. Occupancy management. Transfer recommendations. The language was deliberately confusing. Complex enough to discourage scrutiny. Simple enough to obtain a signature. Richard finally spoke. "Everything okay?" I looked up. Smiled. "Just reading." He laughed softly. Still reading every page. Old habits. The answer seemed to satisfy him, at least temporarily. I continued turning pages. Then I discovered something unexpected. Something neither Linda nor I anticipated. A physician's statement. Attached near the back. My stomach tightened. The document referenced concerns regarding memory decline. Cognitive impairment. Recommended oversight. For several seconds. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Then I looked closer. The physician's name appeared at the bottom. Someone I had never met. Never visited, never spoken with, a stranger. and somehow this stranger had supposedly evaluated my mental condition. The realization made me physically sick, because it confirmed something terrifying. Richard wasn't merely hinting that I was forgetful. He was actively building documentation to support the claim. Documentation he hoped could eventually justify legal control. I slowly closed the folder. The room became quiet. Richard watched me carefully, waiting, expecting, believing. Finally, I spoke. "This is a lot." His smile returned. "I know. Maybe you're right." His entire posture changed, subtly but noticeably, a hunter sensing victory. "What do you mean?" I looked directly into his eyes. Maybe I've been holding on to responsibilities longer than I should. The lie hurt, but it worked. Richard visibly relaxed. The tension disappeared from his shoulders. For weeks he had worried I might resist. Now he believed resistance was collapsing. Exactly as planned. Exactly as Linda predicted. He reached across the table, touched my hand. "I only want what's best for you." The words almost made me laugh. Instead, I nodded. "I know. Another lie. Another necessary lie." The rest of the evening passed quietly. Richard appeared happier than I had seen him in years. Meanwhile, I excused myself early and retreated to the master bedroom. The moment the door closed, I locked it, then pulled out my phone. 3 messages waited. Linda, Megan, Thomas. All asking the same question. "Did he show you?" My response was immediate. "Yes, and it's worse than we thought." Within minutes, my phone rang. "Linda." I answered immediately. "Tell me everything." I described the paperwork, the authorizations, the physician's statement, the memory decline references, the supposed evaluation, every detail. When I finished, silence followed. Then Linda spoke. Her voice sounded colder than usual. "That's serious." "How serious?" "Potentially very serious." My stomach tightened. Even after everything, hearing concern in Linda's voice still unsettled me. "What now?" "We proceed." Her answer surprised me. "That's it. For now?" I sat on the edge of the bed, listening, thinking. Finally, I asked the question haunting me all evening. "Why is he moving so fast?" Silence. Then Linda answered, "Because he's desperate." The same conclusion Thomas reached earlier. The same conclusion I had been avoiding. Desperation, not confidence, not strategy. Desperation. Richard wasn't accelerating because he was winning. He was accelerating because time was running out. After the call ended, I walked onto the balcony overlooking the ocean. The night air felt cool against my skin. Below, waves crashed rhythmically against the shore. For a few moments, everything felt peaceful. Then movement near the beach caught my attention. A figure, standing near the dunes, watching the cottage. At first I assumed it was a tourist, or a neighbor. Then the figure stepped into a patch of moonlight, and my heart nearly stopped, because I recognized her immediately. Vanessa. She wasn't supposed to be there, at least not openly, yet there she stood, less than 100 yards from the house, watching, waiting. My pulse accelerated. I ducked behind the railing, carefully peered through the shadows. Vanessa remained near the dunes for several minutes, looking toward the cottage, looking toward the deck, looking toward the future she believed Richard had promised her. Then something happened that changed everything. A second figure emerged from the darkness. A man, tall, broad-shouldered. Someone I had never seen before. Vanessa handed him something. A folder. He opened it briefly, examined the contents. Then both disappeared into the night. I stood frozen, trying to process what I had witnessed, because one thing was immediately obvious. Vanessa wasn't acting like a woman waiting for a romantic future. She was acting like someone involved in a business transaction. And suddenly a terrifying possibility entered my mind. What if the beach house wasn't the final goal? What if Richard and Vanessa planned to sell it? What if there was another player involved? Someone we hadn't identified yet. Someone connected to the mystery. Someone important enough to meet secretly on the beach at night. I stared into the darkness long after they vanished, and for the first time in weeks, I realized our investigation might still be missing a critical piece of the puzzle. I barely slept that night. After seeing Vanessa meet a mysterious man near the dunes, my mind refused to slow down. Questions kept circling through my head. Who was he? Why had Vanessa given him a folder? What was inside it? And most importantly, how did he fit into Richard's plan? By sunrise, I still didn't have answers. But one thing was certain. The confrontation we had been preparing for was only hours away. I stepped onto the porch just after dawn. The Atlantic stretched endlessly before me. Calm, beautiful, deceptively peaceful. Inside the cottage, Richard was already awake. I could hear him moving around the kitchen, making coffee, whistling. The sound sent a chill through me. He was happy. Not because he loved me. Not because he appreciated the beach house. Because he believed today was the day everything became his. Or so he thought. I checked my phone. A text from Linda waited. We're in position. Another from Megan. Love you, Mom. And finally, one from Thomas. Ready when you are. I took a deep breath, then walked back inside. Richard stood at the kitchen island pouring coffee. He smiled when he saw me. Morning. Morning. His eyes immediately drifted toward the leather folder sitting on the counter. There was no point pretending anymore. We both knew why we were here. The difference was that only one of us knew how the day would end. Around 11 o'clock, Richard suggested we move into the living room. The room overlooked the ocean through a wall of windows. Sunlight filled every corner. It was one of my favorite rooms in the entire house. Today it had been transformed into something else. A stage. The leather folder sat on the coffee table. Several pens had been carefully arranged beside it. Richard had planned every detail. Everything looked professional, orderly, respectable. Exactly the image he always tried to project. I sat across from him, calm, patient, waiting. Richard opened the folder, removed several documents, then slid them toward me. There are just a few signatures we need. The same line, the same performance, the same smile. I lowered my eyes toward the paperwork, not because I needed to read it. Linda had already reviewed copies. I knew what was there. What mattered now was allowing Richard to reveal himself. So I took my time, page by page, slowly, carefully. The silence stretched. Eventually Richard shifted in his chair. You know, we don't have to make this complicated. I looked up. Complicated. He laughed softly. I trust you. The hypocrisy almost took my breath away. Trust. The man who had spent years lying to me was talking about trust. I smiled politely. Then you shouldn't mind me reading. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. Gone almost instantly. But I saw it. The mask slipping, just for a moment. Then he leaned back again. Of course. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. Finally, another voice entered the conversation. A female voice. Everything going okay? I looked toward the doorway, and there she was, Vanessa Reed, standing inside my beach house. My stomach tightened, not because I was surprised, because I wasn't. I had expected her. What surprised me was her confidence. She wasn't pretending anymore. No fake business relationship. No professional distance. No carefully maintained cover story. She walked into the room like she belonged there, like she already owned the place. Richard stood immediately. Vanessa is just helping with the paperwork. Just helping. The lie sounded ridiculous. Vanessa smiled. A smile I once might have described as charming. Now it looked predatory. Good to see you again, Carla. I nodded. Likewise. The tension became almost physical. Richard tried to regain control. Why don't we focus on finishing the documents? Vanessa sat down, crossed her legs, then glanced around the room. The room where my parents once celebrated anniversaries. The room where Megan opened Christmas presents as a child. The room filled with memories she could never understand. Then Vanessa made a mistake, a very important mistake. She pointed toward the hallway. We should repaint the master bedroom, too. The room became silent. Richard froze. Vanessa froze. And slowly, I looked at her. The master bedroom. For the first time, uncertainty entered her expression. Richard immediately jumped in. She's talking about market value. I ignored him, still looking directly at Vanessa. Interesting. She swallowed. Nobody spoke. Then she made an even bigger mistake. Well, if we're going to live here... The moment the words left her mouth, she realized what she had done. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Vanessa looked horrified. And I smiled. Not because it was funny, because the performance was finally over. No need to continue pretending. Richard's face hardened. The transformation was immediate. Gone was the caring husband. Gone was the concerned partner. Gone was the patient protector. For the first time, I saw the real Richard. Cold. Calculating. Angry. What exactly are you implying? I laughed softly. Implying. Then I looked toward Vanessa. You sold your condo, didn't you? Silence. I continued. Richard promised you this house. Neither answered, which was answer enough. The room remained still. Then Richard stood. His voice became sharper. Carla, you're confused. There it was. The strategy. The same strategy he had been building for years. Confused. Forgetful. Unstable. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. I looked directly at him. No. His jaw tightened. You're imagining things. No. You don't understand what you're reading. No. His composure began cracking. Vanessa looked increasingly uncomfortable. Neither of them had expected resistance. Neither of them had expected preparation. Neither of them realized the trap had already closed. Richard took a step forward. You're not well. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because even now, standing on the edge of disaster, he still believed the same lie. That I was weak. That I was vulnerable. That I was alone. The front door opened. Every head turned. And then everything changed. Linda Harper entered first, calm as ever, professional as ever. Behind her came Megan, then Thomas Reynolds, and behind Thomas was another man. The mysterious man I had seen on the beach the previous night. Recognition flashed across Vanessa's face immediately. Her color drained. Richard looked stunned, completely stunned. The newcomer stepped forward. "I believe we've met, Miss Reed." Vanessa looked like she wanted to disappear. I stared at him, trying to understand. Then Thomas answered the question before I could ask it. "This is Daniel Price." The man nodded. "Private investigator." The room exploded into silence. My heart pounded. Private investigator. Suddenly everything made sense. The beach meeting, the folder exchange, the secrecy. Linda smiled faintly. "Mr. Price has been assisting our investigation." Richard looked from face to face, trying desperately to understand what was happening, trying desperately to regain control. But control was gone. Vanessa spoke first. "What investigation?" Daniel Price opened a folder, the same folder she had handed him on the beach. And when he placed it on the coffee table, I immediately recognized what it contained. Copies, contracts, property documents, financial records, communications, evidence, a lot of evidence. Richard's expression changed. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw genuine fear, not irritation, not frustration. Fear, real fear. Because he finally understood something. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It wasn't an argument. It wasn't even a marital dispute. It was an exposure. And the evidence was about to speak for itself. Linda sat down calmly, opened another folder, then looked directly at Richard. "Before anyone signs anything today," she said, "I think we need to discuss why you're attempting to transfer rights to a property that neither you nor Carla actually own." The color vanished from Richard's face. Vanessa turned toward him, confused, alarmed, and suddenly, for the first time, she looked every bit as shocked as he did. The silence inside Seabreeze Cottage felt almost unreal. For weeks, I had imagined this moment, the moment Richard's carefully constructed world finally began to crack. Now it was happening, and somehow it was even more shocking than I expected. Richard stood frozen. Vanessa looked completely blindsided. Linda remained calm. Thomas sat quietly observing. Megan stood beside me, and Daniel Price, the private investigator, placed a thick folder on the coffee table. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Vanessa broke first. "What does she mean?" Her voice sounded strained, confused. She looked directly at Richard. "What does she mean the house doesn't belong to them?" Richard didn't answer. That alone was revealing, because for the first time since I met Vanessa, her confidence vanished. She turned toward Linda. "What are you talking about?" Linda opened a folder, removed several documents, then calmly slid them across the table. "The property is owned by an irrevocable trust." Vanessa stared at the paperwork. Confusion quickly transformed into disbelief. "What?" "The trust owns Seabreeze Cottage." Linda pointed to the legal documents. "Not Richard." Then she pointed toward me. "Not Carla." Vanessa looked back and forth between us. "This isn't possible." The words came out almost as a whisper. I realized something important in that moment. Vanessa hadn't known. At least not completely. Maybe she knew some details. Maybe Richard told partial truths, but she clearly believed the house would eventually become theirs. Otherwise, she wouldn't be reacting this way. Richard finally spoke. "Vanessa." "No." She interrupted him immediately. The single word cracked like a whip. "No." Her eyes locked onto him. "You told me this was settled. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Years of deception were finally colliding, and neither Richard nor Vanessa could stop it." "You said the house would be ours." Richard opened his mouth, closed it again, then tried another approach. "It's complicated." The worst possible answer. Vanessa laughed, a harsh, bitter laugh. "Complicated?" She pointed toward Linda. "Is she lying?" "No." Vanessa's face drained of color. The room became completely silent, because everyone understood what that answer meant. Richard knew. He always knew. The documents Linda possessed proved it. 23 years earlier, he had signed paperwork acknowledging that Seabreeze Cottage could never belong to him. He knew. And despite that knowledge, he had spent years promising it to Vanessa. A promise he could never legally keep. The realization finally hit her. I watched it happen in real time. Shock, disbelief, anger, humiliation, one emotion after another. Then came the question that changed everything. If the house isn't yours. She swallowed. Then what exactly have we been doing?" Richard didn't answer. Again and again. His silence became an answer. Vanessa slowly stood. For the first time, she looked less like a confident mistress and more like another victim. Not innocent. Certainly not innocent, but manipulated, just like everyone else. Daniel Price finally spoke. "There are additional matters." His voice was calm, professional. He opened the folder he carried, then distributed several copies around the room. Vanessa glanced down. Her expression immediately changed. "What is this?" Thomas answered. "Financial records?" I watched Richard carefully. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. He already knew where this was going, and he hated it. Daniel continued. "Over the past 2 years, substantial sums of money were transferred through accounts controlled by Mr. Gibson." Vanessa started reading. The deeper she went, the more alarmed she appeared. Then she looked up sharply. "What are these?" No one answered immediately. Vanessa looked at another page, then another, then another. Finally, she turned directly toward Richard. "These amounts aren't right." Richard remained silent. The silence was becoming a habit. Vanessa's voice grew louder. "You told me the investments were yours. Still nothing." My stomach tightened, because I already knew what she was about to discover. And judging by her reaction, she didn't. Then she found it. The source accounts. Joint marital account, retirement accounts, accounts connected to me. The room became very quiet. Vanessa stared at the paperwork, then at Richard, then back at the paperwork. "You used her money." The question hung in the air, heavy, unavoidable. No answer came. Vanessa laughed again. This time there was no humor in it, only disbelief. "Oh my God." She looked sick, physically sick. "You used her money." Still silence. The truth no longer required confirmation. The evidence was sitting directly in front of her. I expected satisfaction, vindication, maybe even joy. Instead, I felt something stranger, sadness. Because watching Richard collapse wasn't satisfying. It was tragic. This was a man I once loved, a man I trusted, a man who once held our newborn daughter in his arms and cried with happiness. Now I barely recognized him. Years of greed had hollowed him out, left nothing but ambition and deception. Vanessa wasn't finished. Far from it, she grabbed another document, then another. Suddenly her eyes widened. What is this? Daniel glanced down. The LLC records. My pulse quickened. The shell company. The company connected to Vanessa's office. The company Richard intended to use. Vanessa flipped pages rapidly, then stopped. What? Her voice cracked. The room waited. Then she looked directly at Richard. You put my name on this, Richard finally reacted. Vanessa. No. She slammed the papers onto the table. You put my name on this without telling me. The situation was escalating rapidly. Linda exchanged a glance with Thomas. Both remained silent, allowing the truth to emerge naturally. Vanessa looked furious now, genuinely furious. What did you do? Richard stood abruptly, his calm facade finally shattered. I was trying to protect us. The statement exploded through the room. Protect us. Us. Not me, not Carla, not our marriage. Us. Him and Vanessa. The confession landed heavily. For the first time, Richard stopped pretending. And once he started talking, he couldn't stop. Years of pressure were finally breaking through. I did everything for us. Vanessa stared at him, speechless. Richard continued, I was trying to build a future. His voice grew louder, more emotional, more desperate. I gave everything to make this work. Then came the sentence that changed everything. The sentence that revealed the true heart of his betrayal? I deserved that house. Silence. Absolute silence. Because in that moment, every lie suddenly made sense. Not love, not romance, not destiny. Entitlement. Richard believed he deserved Seabreeze Cottage. After all these years, after decades of marriage, after helping maintain it, after living beside me. Somewhere along the way, he convinced himself the house should be his. And once that belief took root, everything else followed. The affair, the manipulation, the financial theft, the lies, the separation from Megan, all of it, one poisonous belief. I deserve it. The realization seemed to hit Vanessa too, because her anger suddenly disappeared. In its place came understanding, not agreement, understanding. She was finally seeing the man behind the promises, the man behind the charm, the man behind the fantasy, and she didn't like what she saw. Then Daniel Price opened one final folder, the thickest folder of all, the folder everyone had been waiting for. Inside were transcripts, photographs, recordings, investigation reports, evidence collected over months. Daniel placed it on the table, then looked directly at Richard. We haven't even discussed the forged communications yet. Richard's face went white, completely white. My pulse accelerated, because I knew exactly what Daniel meant. The emails, the messages, the years of interference between Megan and me. Richard looked like a man watching a train approach with nowhere to run. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized something important. The affair wasn't actually the worst thing he had done. Not even close. Because the next set of revelations was about to expose the betrayal that hurt the most. The betrayal of family. The room felt heavy with silence, not the peaceful kind. The kind that comes after a bomb explodes. The kind that follows a truth nobody can take back. Richard stood motionless beside the coffee table. Vanessa remained seated, staring at the evidence scattered before her. Megan stood beside me. For the first time in years, my daughter and I were on the same side of something, and somehow that mattered more than Richard's downfall. Daniel Price opened the final folder. The one containing evidence related to the messages, emails, and communications that had driven a wedge between Megan and me. Richard saw the folder and immediately understood. His face tightened. His shoulders stiffened. His breathing changed. It was the reaction of a man who already knew what was inside. Daniel removed several documents, then placed them on the table. These communications were reviewed by independent forensic analysts. Nobody interrupted. Multiple emails allegedly sent by Carla Gibson originated from devices and networks associated with Richard Gibson. The words landed like a hammer. Vanessa looked shocked. Megan closed her eyes briefly, and I simply sat there, listening, because hearing the truth spoken aloud felt different from suspecting it. Daniel continued. Several messages were routed through accounts that Carla Gibson did not regularly access. Another document appeared, then another, then another. A timeline emerged. Dates, messages, login locations, patterns, every piece fit together. Every piece pointed toward the same conclusion. Richard had interfered, repeatedly, deliberately, for years. Vanessa finally looked up. Why, the question was directed at Richard, not at Daniel, not at me, at Richard. And honestly, I wanted the answer too. Why? Why destroy a family? Why manipulate a mother and daughter? Why create years of pain? Richard stared at the floor, then finally spoke. They were always interfering. Megan laughed, a bitter laugh. Interfering. Richard looked toward her. Your mother trusted you more than she trusted me. The statement stunned everyone, including me, because it revealed something ugly, something deeper than greed, jealousy. Years of jealousy. Megan shook her head. You destroyed our relationship because you were jealous. Richard didn't answer directly, but he didn't deny it either. And sometimes silence is the loudest answer of all. I stared at the man I had married, the man I spent 23 years building a life with. And suddenly I understood something. Richard hadn't become this person overnight. The warning signs were always there. Small signs, subtle signs, things I ignored because I wanted to believe the best about him. The affair, the manipulation, the financial theft. None of it appeared from nowhere. It grew slowly, quietly, like rust spreading beneath paint. Then Vanessa stood. The movement startled everyone. She gathered several documents from the table, read them again, then looked directly at Richard. I sold my condo. Nobody spoke. Vanessa continued. I gave up my apartment. Still silence. I turned down another job opportunity because you said we had a future. Her voice began shaking, not from sadness, from anger, pure anger. Then she held up the trust documents. You knew this house wasn't yours. Richard looked away. Vanessa laughed again. This time the sound was almost heartbreaking. You lied to me too. The room remained silent because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend. The evidence had already won. For several seconds, Vanessa simply stared at him. Then she dropped the documents onto the table. I'm done. Richard looked up sharply. Vanessa. No. She pointed toward him. No more lies. Her voice echoed through the room. No more excuses. Then she grabbed her purse, walked toward the door, and left. Just like that. Gone. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just gone. The woman Richard had risked everything for walked out without looking back. The front door closed. The sound echoed through the cottage. Richard didn't move. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered the boxes of missing letters. Emily's birthday invitations. The forged emails. The years Megan and I lost. The sympathy disappeared. Thomas finally spoke. The financial investigation is still ongoing. Richard looked exhausted now. Defeated. The confidence that once filled the room had completely vanished. Thomas continued. We found unauthorized transfers from marital accounts. No response. We found evidence of concealed debt. No response. We found evidence of attempted asset concealment. Still nothing. The silence itself became a confession. Linda closed her folder, then addressed Richard directly. You should obtain legal counsel. A simple statement. But everyone understood what it meant. This situation had moved beyond marital conflict, beyond infidelity, beyond hurt feelings. Consequences were coming. Real consequences. For several moments, nobody moved. Then Richard surprised everyone. He looked directly at me. Not angrily, not defensively. Almost desperately. Carla. I met his gaze. He swallowed. Can we talk privately? The request hung in the air. 23 years of history existed between us. 23 years. Birthdays, holidays, vacations, shared dreams, shared grief, shared life. Finally, I nodded. Linda, Megan, Thomas, and Daniel stepped outside onto the deck. The living room became quiet. Just Richard and me. For the first time all day, he sat across from me, older than I remembered, smaller somehow. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he finally said it. I'm sorry. The words sounded strange, almost unfamiliar, because they came far too late. I stared at him, waiting. Eventually he continued. I never meant for things to go this far. I couldn't help it. I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was absurd. You didn't mean for what to go this far. His eyes dropped. The affair. The lies. The money. The emails. The manipulation. I shook my head. Which part exactly? Richard looked exhausted. Broken. And yet something still felt incomplete. Because even now, he seemed sorry about the outcome. Not the choices. The outcome. There is a difference. A very important difference. I loved you. His voice cracked. The statement hurt more than I expected, because part of me believed he meant it. Maybe he did love me once. Maybe he loved me years ago. Maybe he even loved me while betraying me. Human beings are complicated that way. But love without respect eventually becomes meaningless. And respect had disappeared a long time ago. I leaned forward, quietly, calmly. No. Richard looked up. You loved what I gave you. The room fell silent. You loved my trust, I continued. You loved my loyalty. His eyes filled with tears. You loved my support. Still silence. But when the time came to choose between protecting me and benefiting yourself, My voice remained steady. You chose yourself. The truth sat heavily between us. Neither of us could deny it. Finally, Richard looked away, and that was all the answer I needed. A few minutes later, Linda and the others returned. The practical conversations began. Lawyers, investigations, procedures, next steps. Richard barely participated. The fight had left him completely. As evening approached, he packed a small bag, then walked toward the front door. For a moment he stopped, looked back at Seabreeze Cottage, the house he thought would be his, the house he sacrificed everything to obtain, the house he never owned. Then he walked out. No dramatic speech, no final argument, no grand exit, just a man leaving with less than he arrived with. The front door closed behind him, and for the first time in months, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not complete peace. There was still healing ahead, still legal battles, still difficult conversation, but the fear was gone. The manipulation was over. The lies had been exposed. And most importantly, my family was no longer broken. Megan stepped beside me and slipped her arm around my shoulders. Together, we looked out toward the ocean. The same ocean that had watched generations of my family come and go. The same ocean that remained when everything else changed. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt hopeful about the future. The morning after Richard left Seabreeze Cottage, I woke before sunrise. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't startled awake by anxiety. I wasn't replaying conversations. I wasn't analyzing evidence. I wasn't wondering what secret might surface next. Instead, I simply listened. The ocean waves rolled toward shore in a steady rhythm. The same rhythm I had heard since childhood. The same rhythm that comforted my mother. The same rhythm that soothed me after Daniel died. The same rhythm that somehow survived every storm, including this one. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and stepped onto the porch. The air carried the scent of salt and sea grass. Behind me, the cottage was quiet. Inside, Megan and Emily were still sleeping. Just thinking those words made me smile. Megan and Emily, together, here, with me. For years, I believed that relationship had been lost forever. Now, somehow, it had found its way home. A few hours later, Emily emerged from the guest room carrying a mug of hot chocolate. At 16, she looked so much like Megan that sometimes it took my breath away. She sat beside me on the porch swing. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she leaned her head against my shoulder. A simple gesture, but one that nearly brought tears to my eyes. I miss this place, I smiled. I missed having you here. Emily looked out toward the water. Mom always talked about it. The cottage, she nodded. She never stopped. Something tightened in my chest. Even during the years when Megan and I were separated, she had still kept this place alive in her stories. That knowledge meant more than I could explain. Emily continued. She always said it felt like part of our family. I looked at the cottage, the weathered blue walls, the wraparound porch, the dunes stretching toward the ocean. It wasn't just property. Never had been. It was history, memory, legacy. And now, thanks to my mother's foresight, it would remain exactly that. Later that afternoon, Linda called. The legal process was moving forward. Richard had hired an attorney. Several financial investigations were continuing. Asset recovery efforts had begun. There would be months of paperwork ahead, possibly longer. But the important part was simple. The threat was over. The beach house was safe. The trust remained intact. And Richard no longer had any realistic path toward controlling it. When the call ended, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt reflective, because the story wasn't really about winning. Not anymore. At some point, the house stopped being the most important thing. The most important thing was Megan. The relationship we almost lost. The years we could never recover. That realization stayed with me throughout the following weeks. After returning home, life slowly began settling into a new rhythm. Not immediately. Healing never works that way. There were difficult conversations, painful memories, moments of anger, moments of grief, but there were also phone calls, family dinners, visits, small ordinary moments that felt extraordinary because we almost lost them. One evening, about 2 months later, Megan and I sat together on my back patio watching the sunset. The scene reminded me of Seabreeze Cottage. For a while we simply enjoyed the quiet. Then Megan asked a question. "Do you ever regret marrying him?" The question caught me off guard. I thought about it carefully before answering, because the easy answer would have been yes. But life is rarely that simple. Finally, I shook my head. No. Megan looked surprised. Really, I smiled sadly. Regret is complicated. She waited, so I continued. If I hadn't married Richard, I might never have learned how important certain things really are. Megan frowned. What things? I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. This. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. So did mine. Because it was true. The experience taught me something I should have understood years earlier. Relationships require protection. Not from strangers, from silence, from assumptions, from the people who benefit when families stop communicating. If Megan and I had spoken honestly years earlier, everything might have been different. Not because Richard would suddenly become a better person, because his lies would have had nowhere to grow. A few months later, we held a family gathering at Seabreeze Cottage. The first one in years. Friends came. Relatives came. Megan came. Emily came. Even Donna came. The house felt alive again. Laughter filled rooms that had carried so much tension. Memories mixed with new memories. Past and future occupying the same space. At sunset, everyone gathered on the deck. The sky glowed orange and gold above the Atlantic. Emily stood beside the railing taking photographs. Megan laughed with relatives. Children played in the sand below. And for a moment, I thought about my mother. I wished she could see it. The trust she created. The protection she built. The legacy she preserved. She had understood something important. Real inheritance isn't just property. It's opportunity, security, family, the chance for future generations to remain connected. And because of her wisdom, that future still existed. As darkness settled over the water, Emily approached me. She handed me her phone. I took a picture. I looked down. The photograph showed all of us standing together on the deck. 3 generations. Smiling, connected, whole. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. Then Emily asked softly, "What are you thinking about?" I smiled. "The future," she grinned. "Good future or scary future?" I laughed. "Good future. And for the first time in a very long time, I truly meant it, because Richard's betrayal had taken many things: time, trust, peace. But it had also revealed something: the strength of the people who genuinely loved me, the people who stayed, the people who fought for the truth, the people who helped me find my way back to myself. Months later, the divorce was finalized. The financial matters were resolved. The investigations concluded. Life moved forward, not perfectly, not painlessly, but honestly. And honestly was enough. Sometimes I still sit alone on the porch at Seabreeze Cottage, watching the waves roll toward shore, listening to the ocean, remembering everything that happened. When I do, I no longer think about Richard. I don't think about Vanessa. I don't think about the lies. Instead, I think about resilience, about second chances, about family, because in the end, Richard forgot one important detail. The beach house was never the most valuable thing I owned. My family was. And unlike the house, that was something he could never take from me. Some betrayals arrive suddenly. Others happen so slowly that we don't recognize them until years later. This story is not really about a beach house. It is not about money, property, or inheritance. It is about trust. Trust is one of the most valuable things we ever give another person. When placed in the right hands, it creates love, safety, and connection. When placed in the wrong hands, it can be used as a weapon. One of the biggest lessons I learned is that isolation is dangerous. Many manipulators succeed because they separate people from the ones who truly care about them. They create misunderstandings, encourage silence, and allow distance to grow. That is why communication matters so much. Honest conversations can prevent years of unnecessary pain. I also learned that growing older does not make us weak. Age does not erase wisdom. Experience does not disappear simply because someone tries to make us doubt ourselves. Never allow another person to convince you that your voice, your judgment, or your value no longer matter. Most importantly, I learned that family is not defined by perfection. Families make mistakes. Relationships become strained. People drift apart. But when love is genuine, healing remains possible. Sometimes the greatest victory is not exposing a liar. Sometimes the greatest victory is rebuilding what was broken. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced betrayal, manipulation, or a difficult family conflict? What would you have done in Carla's situation? Please share your perspective in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy emotional family stories like this one. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world right now.